David Micley and his wife Molly grew up in Newton and are the parents of 3 children who are the 5th generation of Micleys to call Newton home. He brings a diverse experience from public, nonprofit, and private sectors, along with an MBA from MIT. A lifelong resident of Dan, a lifelong Newton resident and local small business owner, Dan Gaynor served as a presidential appointee in the Obama-Biden administration and is dad to a future Cabot School student. He's endorsed by over half the city council and prioritizes walkability, affordability, and sustainability. So without further ado, Marjorie, I'm going to pass it on to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, there's a little bit of Groundhog Day about this, gentlemen, since we went through this before the preliminary, but we'll try to shake it up a little bit. So let's start with this. What are your 3 top priorities and why? Plus, could you tell us a little bit about how those priorities have informed the activities that you've undertaken in your community? So according to the spinner, we're starting with David.
Yeah, thanks. And good to see you, Dan. Good to be here. My 3 priorities are surrounding improving basic city services in Newton. And it starts with streets and infrastructure. Our roads are in terrible condition. I'd like to see us improve funding to our Department of Public Works so we can more rapidly repair our roads. The second is schools. I'm a big supporter of the schools. I have 3 kids. My oldest will be a public school student in 1 year. I started my career as a teacher. My wife was a social worker at Bigelow. I am concerned about the state of our schools and think our teachers need to be paid better. Our students need to be supported better. We need more better mental health support. And then responsible zoning. And that really comes from my conversations I've had with residents across Ward 2 that are open to growth, but in a way where Newton gets to lead the decision-making rather than developers. And finally, constituent services. My number is 617-413-6330. You know you can always reach out. Thank you.
That little beep says when it's time to stop. Dan?
I'm focused on a few core priorities that are undergirded by the values that I grew up with here as a hometown kid, born and raised, and still living on Cabot Street. Focus on walkability, affordability, and sustainability. That cascades a variety of issues here in Newton. First is smarter development. We've got to make sure that our villages are more affordable at a variety of price points, more accessible for families, bringing life to empty storefronts like the empty CVS building in Newtonville. As a local small business owner, I believe that we should bring in diverse entrepreneurs to contribute revenue, but also bring vitality to our villages. The second is sustainable innovation that starts with safer streets. We've got to make it safer to walk and bike, but also as a career sustainability advocate, I believe that we need to have a plan to address climate change head on with everything from connected bike lanes to, of course, planting more trees. And then lastly, focusing on our schools. As the dad to a future Cabot School student, we've got to invest in our educators.
All right, well, let's move on to what is probably the most challenging question facing us in the city today, namely rezoning. Over the last few years, the administration and city council have been drafting new higher density zoning to meet 2 goals. First, to fulfill the state's MBTA Communities Act, which requires Newton to rezone for 8,330 new residential units. Second, in addition to that act, Newton has been working on the Village Center Overlay District, rezoning to reinvigorate our village centers and maximize capacity for more residential units, emphasizing walkability and reduced vehicular use. As the rezoning proposal has been modified, and as the state has changed what new units it would count, local residents have heard proposals ranging from as high as 15,000 new units to as low as 7,300 to 9,300 units. The fluidity of the numbers has been a challenge from a communications perspective. The goals of this rezoning movement are very important, but even counselors heading up this whole effort say that the state's formula is flawed. So what are the voters of Newton to make of all this? Dan, what do you believe is the number of new residential units that may be built by right? And are you comfortable with this whole proposal?
Thanks for asking this question. I've talked to over 10,000 different voters, and one of the things that I've seen consistently is confusion and sometimes fear around this plan. Let's be clear. The MBTA Communities Act is requiring 177 cities and towns from Worcester to Somerville to Newton to zone for the potential to build new units. He does not mandate us to build one additional unit. The big difference between some of the conversation right now is the difference between zoning and building. And let's be clear, we do not have to build one unit under the MBTA Communities Act, let alone 8,330. Indeed, to your point, it is a compliance formula. We actually get credit for more units at Austin Street than we actually have built. We get credit for 120, but we currently have built 60. For that reason, I'm focused on working within the contours of the plan to shape the map and make sure that Newtonville doesn't disproportionately bear the burden of development.
David, what light can you shed on all of this?
Yeah, Dan and I have different policy views on development, and to clarify them, I like to continue the conversation we started last debate. Boylston Properties endorsed Dan, not because he did anything wrong, but because they viewed him as the more pro-developer candidate, and that point stands. Gaynor's policies give more power to developers. He wants up to 6 stories in Newtonville by right. I support up to 4. I support complying with the law and zoning for 8,300 units. Gaynor supports thousands more by right, which gives up city leverage I want us to keep to demand more from developers, such as more affordability, more ownership opportunities, more protections for our small businesses, and for growth to be spread more evenly across the city. Our development policies are different, and it's important for voters to be informed on those differences, so I'm excited for this conversation.
I'd like
Dan,
to
I think you can, yes, you'll have
Yeah,
something.
one of the things that I addressed in the last debate is the unfortunate continued negative attacks from Mr. Micley trying to tie me to developers that he has actually met with in person, and I never have, let alone worked with, let alone asked for their endorsement, let alone took money from. I haven't. But one of the things that I found particularly disappointing on this thread is that this week, Mr. Micley sent out yet another attack ad. This is something my neighbor gave to me, claiming that I support 6 stories of height. The problem with this attack ad, and I'm choosing my words carefully, is that it is a lie. I have never and do not support 6 stories of height. I support 4.5 stories maximum under the Village Center Overlay District Plan. Mr. Micley, I don't know where that came from. You could have texted me. You could have called me. You could have clarified. This is a very, very clear example of misinformation that you're using to fearmonger your way into office. It is not a productive use, and I would really appreciate if you stuck to the positive and the policy, not go for personal cheap shots.
Okay, David, you can say something about that, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, and let's talk about the policy. So what I've read from your support of VCOD and its various versions was actually at one point you support up to 7 stories, the 5.5 with 2 bonus, or the 4.5 with 2 bonus. You supported VCOD from the beginning. When I asked city councilors that were endorsing you why they did endorse you, they said because you supported the Village Overlay District Plan in its totality, where I had questions and critiques. And as of most recently, we have the Area Council questionnaire where you support 4.5 stories with a bonus story, which gets to 5.5 stories, which is really 6 stories. So just tell me honestly, how is that not 6 stories? Let's unpack.
I do think this is, I'm sorry, but I do think this is important. I just want to make sure I address this. Mr. Micley, even in your most generous version of the plan, you put out an attack ad to thousands of people claiming that I support 6-story buildings. To be clear, I only support VC3, maximum of 4 stories with a pitch roof, which is 4.5 stories tall, with an affordability incentive to go to 25% affordable units. You add an additional 2,500 square feet. You can generously call that 5 stories. There is no version of any stated position that I have that is 6 stories. And you putting out an attack ad that claims that I support 6-story buildings, of which you have no evidence behind, is, and again, choosing my words carefully, an unfortunate lie. I don't think that you need to fearmonger your way to the ballot box.
We've got to cut it at that, Dan.
Yeah.
A major concern
Can I just
is a
clarify?
lack of affordable housing, affordable specifically. How would these plans, if passed in their current form, address the need for affordable housing? And along with that, maybe you can give us a sense of how many affordable units and what does affordable actually mean in terms of rentals or even units to buy. So let's start this one with David.
Sure, and just to close the thought on the last point, VC3 goes up to 5.5 stories, which is really 6 stories. So that is accurately describing your support, describing your public positions, and I'm fine if we continue to discuss that to really unpack that. But
Okay, on to affordable housing, please.
On to affordable housing. So our inclusionary zoning policy encourages more affordable housing when projects are built at scale. MBTA Communities Act says nothing about affordability, but because of our inclusionary zoning, there will be more affordability by this virtue of development. My issue is it generally ends up just being rentals. And when we lose the oversight over large scale development, when we give up all this by right development, which is what Dan supports, we don't have the ability to tell developers, you need to build more ownership opportunities for affordability. You need to do more things around spreading the development evenly across the city. It just loses our ability to have more leverage. So I think it does further to some extent, but it could do even more if we had our special permit power over large scale development, which I want to keep.
Dan, your thoughts on the affordable provision?
We'll move on from the attack ads, but just to be clear, just to reiterate, the maximum height by right in the village center plan is 4.5 stories. The only way you can add an additional 2,500 square feet is if you reach a very aggressive affordability target of 25%. And anyone who can count to 6, make clear, 5 stories is not 6 stories. David, what you put out as my position is, again, choosing my words carefully, a lie that you have no evidence behind. And I urge you to retract it and issue a clarification to the thousands of people you sent it to. With regard to answering the question, we have to address affordability at 3 ends of the spectrum. Buildings like the Armory, which we bought for $1 and is 43 fully affordable units. Zones like MRT, multi-residential transit, where you can take a 2-family house and turn it into a 4-unit house. And then lastly, like I said, installing incentives for developers to offer affordable units at a range of incomes from 30% to 80% AMI in any new big development.
So can you give us an idea very quickly? This is not a long answer. People speak about 30% AMI.
Sure.
What is the level of income? And can you give us a level of rental that we can actually picture as opposed to the formulas? David.
Yeah, I mean, so AMI levels range from 50 to 80% AMI to 110%, depending on sort of how large scale of a building we're talking about. And, you know, honestly, they're still expensive. It's still expensive to live in Newton, and that's only going to be for a pocket of the housing that's built, 15 to 20%, sometimes more. And like Dan said, there's the incentives if you go to 25% that add a whole story. So it adds some square footage and a whole story, which, you know, you have supported the proposal in its fullness until now. So if you are changing your opinion, that's fine to say, Dan, and I'm fine to update my materials based on your—
Again, where are you talking about this? You have no evidence you've been offering on this front, David. If you have evidence, please cite written commentary that I've made. But the idea that I am somehow supportive of more floors than the plan offers is absolute malarkey. You can't continue to make these assertions without evidence.
The plan
Okay,
supports—
let's get down to the most simple granular question about affordable housing then. Where in your ward are the best prospects for more affordable housing? Dan first.
Absolutely. On the map, we've got 3 different zones. VC3, 4.5 stories max by right, unless you add the affordability incentives. VC2, 3.5 stories, and then MRT. I'm a big fan of MRT. A lot of the things that I've been trying to do is trim down the size of the map in Newtonville to make sure that we've got more accessible and affordable development, whether you're a senior looking to downsize or you're a young family looking to come in and contribute to our community. Those housing units in an MRT district are the best chance we have for affordable housing right now at market rates that are slightly under the exorbitant 1.8 million average home price in Newton. It means that we can take a 2-family house and add a few units. It means that it creates incentives to deter tear downs, so you can add a few additional units in the back. I'm supportive of those. But we do exist in a system called capitalism, so it's hard to say exactly where. I would like to install more of those units on Austin Street and down Walnut Street.
David.
Yeah, I'm a big supporter of the MRT zones in general too. I think they do a great job incentivizing repurpose of older homes to allow you know, housing of different sizes for young families, for elderly people looking to downsize. And I think we need to focus on more of that and less on the large scale apartment buildings, especially not allowing those by right. You know, that will obviously, those big buildings will also have some element of housing that's affordable, but I think the missing middle, sort of that in-between space between a single family and large apartment buildings, is what we need the most more affordability in. And I'd say that, you know, just pushing back publicly on the various versions of the village rezoning proposal has been probably the most effective way to get it to a more reasonable place where, again, Newton and the public gets to drive decision-making rather than developers, which is what the proposal currently does in its current form.
Okay, now there are 2 major public projects underway in Ward 2. Can you share your opinion about the New Cal project and also the Gath Pool at Arons-Barron? That is in Ward 2, right? Okay, let's start with Dan.
Well, I'm glad that the Gath pool is finally underway. I was meeting just yesterday over in Precinct 1 with a swim coach who's been teaching generations of children swim lessons there. There's a few tweaks I would have liked to make to it. For example, I would have liked to expand the recreational pool so that the swim lane pool isn't filled up with, for example, people just joking around, like people like me with their kids. That said, I am glad it's moving forward. As far as I understand, we are on track to open next summer. I think it's super important for our athletes to have access to that. And of course, when we look, I actually want to broaden the question out. When we look at projects like NewCal, what we've got to do is make sure that we've got a competitive bidding process. I'm a small business owner here. I want to make sure that we're holding developers accountable for protecting our priorities and using the leverage that we have to extract concessions. I would like to see additional vendors come to the NewCal project.
David.
Yeah, I'm a big supporter of both projects. I think the Gath pool is overdue for a redo, and I'm really excited about that. The splash pad, the plans, it's going to be great for families of all ages. And NewCal, we need a place for our seniors to gather, and not just our seniors, for the wider community. I'm a big believer in making sure Newton remains a thriving multi-generational community. My parents live around the corner from me. I grew up with my grandmother down the street. And that's what makes Newton special. And that's what I'm excited about with NewCal, that it's not just focused on seniors, but it's focused on bringing the whole community together in a place where we can interact, connect, and build community.
Okay, what remaining green spaces are there in Ward 2, and what would you do to preserve them? On this, we'll start with David.
Yeah, there's lots of great green spaces across Ward 2. One of my personal favorites is Edmonds Park. I'm a member of the Friends of Edmonds Park, and I want to support that group in all ways I can. There's great people there that, this regular citizens maintaining the trails, making sure that's usable space. And that's an example of across our city, the great, resident groups that are doing their part to protect our green spaces. There's Friends of Bullows Pond. They've done incredible work protecting a lot of trees that the city planned to cut down at one point. So I think it's really about listening to those groups, empowering those groups, and using them as key people on the ground to protect our green spaces and make sure they're clean, usable, and accessible for all.
Dan?
I'm a member of Friends of Edmonds Park, grew up right here on Cabot Street, going there my entire life. I'm a member of Green Newton, and I'm a career environmental and sustainability advocate. It starts by protecting our historic trees. I'm a fan of the new ordinances to make sure that our older and historic trees can stay put. We've lost 20,000 trees since 1983. I want to see us grow back up in that space again. I want to make sure that we're investing in Bullows Park to make sure that that earthen dam isn't an accident waiting to happen, but instead that we're protecting those fragile ecosystems from increasing flooding, including this summer, the second rainiest in Massachusetts history. I'm also focused on protecting areas in and around Newtonville. In particular, Elmwood Park has had gas pipes laying on it for way too long. We need to fix that, as well as Washington Park, which is currently in the plan. We need to make sure those historic homes aren't torn down.
Though I am loath to venture back into the rezoning proposal, there is one way in which we need to look at green spaces. And there have been some concerns raised that that with the rezoning by right, that we are losing leverage over developers in terms of green space preservation. Dan, do you have any concerns about that?
Absolutely. There's no priority I hold more dear than making sure the Garden City stays that way. To be clear, the special permit process right now is a system of exceptions. We're only allowed to build 2-family houses, for example. And what we're going to do with the VCOD plan, and this is a misconception I'm glad we're clarifying, is install more and clearer rules to hold developers' feet to the fire. That means deeper setbacks, wider sidewalks, pedestrian areas like Bramway, protecting trees, replacing trees, and making sure that green space isn't gobbled up by any new development. I've met with city staff about this. The way that we do this is we keep strengthening our city services around environmental reviews, land use reviews, health and human services reviews, and safety reviews to make sure that they're not driving more traffic or gobbling up the green spaces that we're so well regarded for.
David?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I really think that we need to think about the special permit power and how we use it in front of 2 different target groups. One is small developers, which we want to allow them to grow modestly and reasonably. But the other is we still want to have that leverage over large scale developers. Even if we give them guidelines, that's just giving away our leverage if we allow them to do things by right. And that's sort of another big difference between Dan and me. You know, we can talk about the half story here, half story there, and have a difference on where, you know, each other stands. But the main point is that VCOD will allow for thousands of more units across Newton by right. And again, that just gives up city leverage. So even if we have guidelines, we could do more than what those guidelines demand with the leverage of a special permit in action. And we've seen project go up with special permit. In Newtonville, we have 2 projects that went up. It's still possible to do it. And I am totally okay with making sure the large scale developers have to go through that process so Newton gets as much for our green spaces and for everything when a big project goes up.
I want
You
to
know,
jump in
David,
here if I may on this point, because it's actually a point of distinction. I want to make it clear, the Trio building and the Austin Street building are by multiples larger than the maximum possible allowable size building under the VCOD plan. Trio is about 120,000 square feet. That's 4 times larger than what it would be allowed under the VCOD plan. We are still going to maintain, and I certainly want us to maintain, our special permit process if we have a truly large building. But what we currently have right now are Italian restaurants like Camella's going through a special permit process because they owe the city 7 parking spaces in exchange for their 34 seats in the restaurant. This is onerous and it's crushing small businesses. We need clarity, not more regulations.
let me ask of the 2 of you, let's say the large developer makes certain promises, gets the development up, and then comes back to the board and says, oh, yeah, I said that I wouldn't rent out to a bank. We were going to support local businesses. But the board then turns around, or whoever is in charge of that, and goes against the conditions allowed under the permitting. How do you control that? How do you make the permit really stand for something? David, and then Dan, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. As far as the special permit goes for small businesses, I am a supporter of streamlining the process so that they can repurpose existing space, not talking about build outs, talking about reuse, and make that a lot easier. So I agree with Dan on that point. I've talked to a lot of small business owners about ways that we can do that. But to your actual question, that is 100% an issue. And we've seen that with the buildings that have gone up in Newtonville, where they made promises to not, you know, in the Trio building, to not have a bank, and then they asked for an exception. So I think we have to hold developers accountable. And I think the best people to hold developers accountable are not going to be the ones that are endorsed by developers, or are not going to be the ones that are allowing twice as much by right development. It's a battle, it's a challenge. Developers are obviously a part of building out our city, but they're a counterparty to our negotiations, and we need to stand strong for our residents and our city.
Dan, will you stand strong?
David, it's yet another cheap shot on the developer endorsement thing. After I called attention to the lie in your last debate, you changed the language of your latest mailer, claiming that they didn't endorse me. And of course they haven't. They're not people I've worked with, and they're people you've met with in person. I would really appreciate if you tried to stick to the positive. I made a promise to you to not go negative. I haven't put out one attack ad, and I'd appreciate if you tried to stick to the data and the substance. Now, with regard to this question, what you do is you install rules that are not fungible. A special permit is by definition an exception. It's always up to the whims of a few city councilors who largely rubber stamp these through to action. So what we do is we create that black line on the map, which we've all seen in various village centers, that mandate a certain type of business is allowed in the space. For example, first floor retail, but not necessarily having a bank. Other examples, small chains, not necessarily big Lululemon stores. We make clarity in the rules and hold the developers' feet to the fire.
You're on mute, Margie. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. How do you gentlemen feel about the transportation options currently available in the city? Newton's leaders propose encouraging residents to use public transport, bikes, or walk by reducing parking requirements and redesigning streets for pedestrians and cyclists. Do you support these measures, and or would you follow a different approach? David?
Yeah, I definitely think we need to make sure that Newton is accessible for various ways of transportation. I personally bike my kids to preschool almost every day, and there's some parts of the city that have good bike lanes, other parts that don't. So I think we need to make better protected and connected bike lanes. I think the public transportation is, really not good, not up to standard. And I think as part of our compliance with the MBTA Communities Act, it's our turn to advocate for better transportation, more frequent commuter rail times, more reliable T. And I think we also have to admit and agree that people are still going to use cars, and make sure that there's places for them to park cars. There's cold winters in Newton. It's still a pretty big city. People still need to get around other ways. So we need to make sure there's options for all people and live in the real and not ideal.
Dan?
Let's admit the obvious. Newton will continue to be a city of folks who have cars. It's not that we should focus on how to mitigate cars. We should make it easier to walk and bike. And that means everything from widening sidewalks to connecting bike lanes, to protecting green spaces, to investing in filling our empty storefronts like the empty CVS, so that we can have 15-minute villages where you can get everything done in one concentrated space and not have to drive around the city, which of course leads to gridlock and traffic. So I'm very focused on making sure that we have walkability. But another thing I'd like to do is use strategic funds in Newton. For example, some of the new $55 million that we have in free cash to restore service to non-core riders of Numo. Right now, it's been reduced just to seniors, and that's so important we keep it for our seniors. But I'd love to see families use that as well. Let's use funds to reinstall Numo citywide.
Just one quick follow-up on that theme. Both cyclists and walkers and drivers are plagued by potholes. Now, everybody wants to fix the potholes. Is it a question of more money, better management, or just who screams loudest to the city or to his or her own counselor? How do we really do something without going insane about it? David.
Yeah, it's a great question. And improving the streets and infrastructure has been a campaign priority since the beginning, because I've heard from residents that's what they're most frustrated with. It's a few things. One is there's more efficient ways that we can repair our roads, but our roads also need more funding. Right now, we put about $9.5 million into road repair. We need more. And that means taking a close look at the budget, thinking about where we can make cuts and allocate more to Department of Public Works. One particular area that I'd like to take a close look at is our special projects. The Newton Library parking lot renovation was $2.5 million. The Livingston Cove renovation at Crystal Lake, which is still underway and was supposed to be done months ago, is over $2 million also. Each of those line items represent a potential 20% increase in our Department of Public Works allocation to road repair. So I'd really like to take a look at that and make sure that we're committing our resources to basic city services like pothole repair.
Dan?
There is no unifying issue like pothole repair and road repair here in Newton. We need a plan that addresses it on multiple fronts. First, from an operational standpoint, let's coordinate our road repaving with infrastructure repairs. We all know on Com Ave, we repaved a road, we had to dig it up 3 years later to install new gas pipelines. It's the reason that as you head up Austin Street, it looks like a patchwork quilt. We've got to make sure that we do the underground and overground repairs at the same time. Second, Newton's growing at 3.5%. Roads equal revenue. If we want to pave our roads faster, we need to generate more revenue and put it into road repair. The best way to do that is to maximize the 5% of our land that is commercial space. Commercial space kicks off literally twice the amount of revenue as a residential property. $20 per thousand of assessed value versus $10 for a home. I want to make sure that we're bringing small and independent businesses here and then repurposing that so we don't have to keep snipping out our budget.
Okay, now you mentioned, Dan, the whole question of surplus funds being reallocated. The city has $40 million in surplus funds. The mayor proposed putting a large portion of that into something called a new Operations Booster Stabilization Fund. Just last week, the city council turned her down. What's the dispute here, and what do you think that we should be doing with that money? David, and then Dan.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. I think there's an issue of sort of process and policy on this. I think the first issue is I would have liked to see a better process where there was more collaboration, more engagement with city councilors and school committee members and other stakeholders to figure out what's a good use of this fund before making a proposal. Second is I'd like to see a more clear commitment to having the funds allocated to schools. Right now, we had budget cuts in the schools. Kindergarten aides were cut. Middle school class sizes are growing. I talked to one high schooler a few weeks ago that had 25 kids in their class, didn't have enough room to sit. So I think we really need to make sure to shore that up and also put more of the funds into basics like road repair, like infrastructure, but do it in a collaborative way where various stakeholders come together and talk about a plan that's going to work for Newton rather than locking it up into one priority over 8 years.
Daniel?
I do agree with my opponent. We need to embrace community engagement up front as part of the planning process. But let's go back You can tell them somebody tries to do his homework here and look at the plan. There's about $55 million in free cash. It's a bit more than 10% of our annual $500 million budgets. And the way that we found it, these one-time funds, were because we spent a little bit less money on things like snow removal in an otherwise light winter. We made more money on hotels and marijuana than expected, so we had some savings. We also got some money out of escrow from a lawsuit that we had against Eversource, the power company, who wasn't paying its taxes for using our telephone poles. I would like to use the vast majority of the free cash in our schools, whether it's capital projects like new HVAC systems, support like COVID catch-up tutoring, professional development for our teachers, aides, subs, and other areas where we can make sure that Newton's schools remain the crown jewel. I'd also, as I mentioned, like to expand NUMO and look at ways to devote more of it to road repair.
You mentioned population shrinking or growing. Could you elaborate on that? And I'd like to hear from both of you what you think is the optimal population in the city in terms of infrastructure and schools. And, you know, do you have a sense of this city looking ahead 5 and 10 years? Dan.
So Newton actually peaked in population a little while ago. In 1975, we had 17,000 kids in our public schools. Today, because of how hard it is for young families to move here, we're going to have 11,000 kids in our public schools in 2025. So we've dropped considerably even as Newton has grown. One of the things that's interesting is that we've got some fixed costs here in Newton. I'm a business owner. I think about budgets and P&Ls all the time. For example, our sewer has capacity, but we pay fixed costs for it. Electricity, same sort of thing. So we have to make sure that we've got the right equilibrium of population. And it's so important on two fronts: young families and seniors. First, seniors who contributed so much to our community need the array of housing options necessary for them to downsize and stay here and continue to live in Newton. Young families need to be able to come in and bring those kindergartners that are essential to making sure we can keep schools like Ward open, which we now have to cut due to classes.
I'm going to be very heavy-handed.
Please.
David.
Yeah, I think we want some modest amount of population growth. We want some modest amount of turnover. We want to allow people to come in and people to move out when they're ready to. And I think we also have to take into account the capacity of the city, whether it's the schools or the streets or the traffic. Those are all real issues. And I think we need to, you know, as we are planning this zoning redesign, need to keep that in mind and make sure that we have Newton as a welcoming place, that we have diverse types of housing so more people can make their home here, but that we do it in a way that the city has the capacity to serve them. So I think growing is always important. Making Newton welcoming for new people is always important. And, you know, there's all sorts of resources that are limited, whether it's the fields, the amount of space on the roads, or, you know, our various city services. But I think we do want to grow, and we want to grow modestly.
Okay, here's a question that never goes away, not since the preliminary and not for a long time before then. OPEB funding. Is the city adequately funding its post-retirement health benefits? And let's expand that and say, well, what are the ways that you would put the city of Newton on firmer financial footing? And would you have any additional thoughts on revenue, more revenue that can be squeezed out of the pilot program, payments in lieu of taxes by nonprofits? David.
Yeah, this is an issue that I'm close to. I'm a trustee on our OPEB board, and I really want to give the mayor credit here. This is something that a lot of past mayors have kicked the can down the road on, and she's made a commitment and a disciplined plan to ensure that we're funding our pension liabilities and our OPEB liabilities, which are both meaningful liabilities and are going to continue to put pressure on our budget over the coming years, which is going to make it even more important to make good and tough decisions about what we prioritize and how we allocate funds. So the long answer short is that we have a good plan. We're following it. There's probably even some flexibility to push that plan a few years down the road to open up some funding now. And as far as what we can do to get, you know, payment in lieu of taxes, I think we should develop stronger partnerships with our universities on the city, figure out ways to partner on their field use. I don't think we're taking fully advantage of those relationships, and there's a lot of opportunity there.
Dan?
So our obligations to city retirees, of which my dad, for example, is one of them, are on track. We're on track to pay down that pension liability within the next 8 years and on time and in full. But I also share the concern that many city councilors said this year that an overly aggressive schedule for pre-funding our pensions and other post-employment benefits, OPEB, risks delaying urgently needed fixes that we could put into place today. As I mentioned, improving some of the capital, the infrastructure improvements in our schools, like new HVAC systems that can keep our kids like mine, safer when the next pandemic spike drops. So I believe that we have to balance pre-funding these obligations so we meet all our legal and contractual requirements on time, but also get it done, because as we saw with the override, this is a drain on our finances.
Okay, moving right along. Dan, you had made some reference to gas pipes lying along the side of the road. Let's take another look at gas pipes. And what can Newton do to amp up the pressure on National Grid to address the gas leaks that exist across the city and avoid the kind of tragedy that happened in North Andover about 4 years ago? Dan, you start.
Absolutely. It's coordination and vision. As I mentioned, on the coordination front, we have seen gas leaks all across the city. They're not only a climate change issue with a huge emissions, they're a health issue where I have friends of mine, neighbors of mine who run around certain corners to avoid these gas leaks. If you go down by City Hall, there's been an ongoing one. If you go over in Precinct 1 by Yogurt Beach, there's been an ongoing one. If you go to Elmwood Park at the corner of Lowell Ave, and Austin Street, there's been an ongoing issue. So we need to make sure that we're coordinating those underground improvements with the overground pavement. The second thing we can do is be one of the first 10 cities in the state to mandate no new gas infrastructure in new developments. Maura Healey has a pilot program for that. I really want Newton to be a member of it so that we have all electric new buildings and no new gas infrastructure.
What about National Grid?
We absolutely have to hold our providers to account. If there are leaks, then we should use every resource at our disposal, whether it's going in with the state to hold them accountable, doing lawsuits, or making sure that we earn concessions from them for additional safety standards up front in the process.
Okay, David, you get about 10 extra seconds on your time.
Yeah, it's obviously an issue of concern. There's some great groups working on it, like Mothers out front. This is something that Newton technically has no authority over. It's a Department of Public Utilities issue at the state level. So we need to lobby our state leaders, our state representatives to do more on this issue. Gas leaks are a threat to climate change. They're a threat to health. They kill trees. And right now, National Grid charges individual consumers for gas leaks. So we need to lobby the state to change those rules so that National Grid is the one paying for leaks. And if they feel the cost of that, they'll be more incentivized to address those problems. So it's really important to understand where the levers of influence are here and to focus on those as our solution.
How do you gentlemen plan to involve residents in the decision-making process in this town? And can you be very specific, David?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, that's been my focus since the start of the campaign. When I first announced my campaign, I didn't share a grand ambition or a grand vision or seek endorsements from those in power. Instead, I just started knocking on doors and passed out a survey because I wanted to make sure that resident input was at the heart of everything I was doing. And I continue to get responses on that survey. I continue to get feedback from residents at their doors. I continue to share information transparently on my website. I send out a newsletter. I also post it. I ask for feedback regularly. I've shared my cell phone since the beginning of the campaign, and I get calls, I get texts. So it's really about communicating in a two-way street all the time with residents, being there for them, and ensuring that the things I voice, the things I advocate for, are rooted in their concerns and their interests, because that is the role of the ward counselor.
Dan?
Communication is the most important aspect of being a city councilor. You've got to be able to break down difficult policy issues in digestible prose. Like David, I've done surveys and visited over 10,000 of my neighbors to hear firsthand at their doorstep what's important to them. Most importantly, I've been putting out communications, whether those are email posts or social media posts. And I think that the city council could be far more effective in communicating many of the very complicated issues that are driving a lot of fear and uncertainty. And that's the big distinction between the two of us. As you can tell, I made a promise early on this campaign to always stick to the positive, not tear anybody down or try to fearmonger my way through this thing. And I'll continue to hold fast to that promise. That's why I'm working closely with organizations like Voters for Vibrant Newton, Green Newton, Bike Newton, Engine 6, the Gun Violence Prevention Collaborative, to get their policy positions and use it to magnify an overall more comprehensive vision for the city.
The following question
Have a quick
warrants just a yes or a no answer.
No quick
Uh,
response there, Margie. Can I just have a quick response to what he
No,
alluded to?
you'll work it into another part.
Okay.
Actually, you will have a chance coming up right after this yes or no question.
All right, great. Can't wait.
The city used to send out a questionnaire to all households to assess the level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction with different aspects of living in Newton. Would you push to have that survey reactivated? Yes or no? Dan, and then David.
Yes.
David.
Yes.
All
That's
right,
a
David. All right, David, you have been waiting for this moment. This is the part where you get to pose a question to your opponent. So we're going to start with you. Let her
Great.
rip.
All right, thank you. No, it's a question that I'm genuinely curious on. Dan, you remind us frequently that you're a local small business owner. I love supporting local small businesses. So what local small business do you currently own? What are its goods and services? And how can I shop there?
David, as somebody who works in the tech industry, I believe you work in crypto, you understand what a SaaS business is. It's a software as a service business. During COVID, I started a business here that uses data to help big businesses adopt better business practices. We work with companies like Pfizer and Netflix to help them embrace sustainability and go net zero, to help big companies embrace diversity and inclusion in their hiring. For example, partnering with minority institutions like HBCUs. I'm really proud of the work that we've done. We've grown from being a small basement operation to having people all around the world and working with big companies to make sure that they're doing a little bit better in honoring their ESG and CSR priorities, putting into practice some of the stuff that they'd otherwise promise in hot air. So I'm proud that I'm the job creator in this race. I'm proud to be the entrepreneur in this race. I'm proud to work with small businesses here to help them improve their tech chops.
And now, Dan, you get to ask David a question.
Yeah, David, you're a long tenured candidate. You've run, I think, a few times before. I think this is your third run for office, your third different seat across 2 different cities. And one of the things I've noticed is some difference in positioning on zoning and housing substantially since you last ran. When I watched your last area council debate, you said a few things that struck me by surprise. And at the minute 31 mark, just to be clear, you actually said this, and I quote, you said, I think our zoning code is way out of date, and I think we can do a comprehensive overhaul, which is far bigger than what we're talking about now. You added that our current special permit process takes, and I'm quoting you here, months of examination and assessment that adds cost to development, cost to housing, and that ultimately makes Newton even less affordable. I'm wondering, David, what to make of this. What should your supporters make of this flip-flopping and inconsistency on housing?
Thanks. Sounded like a jab for a guy who wants to stay positive, but all good. I can definitely answer that. This has not changed my view at all. And I actually alluded to this in the beginning of the debate. There is a difference in how we should think about special permit usage for small development versus large scale for-profit developers like Boylston Properties. For small developers, I want to allow them to do more with less pain. Especially for small businesses, I want to allow them to repurpose their existing businesses with less pain. And I think this MBTA Communities Act is such a great opportunity to unleash more by right housing in a way that meets our needs to create diverse housing supply for residents across ages. What I don't want is to allow that good idea to be taken to the extreme, to allow buildings up to 6 stories to be built by right, to allow twice as many units, 8,300 is a lot, let's do that, to be built by right. So I definitely think the special permit can be abused, and that's why I have a nuanced approach to using it in the appropriate spots and losing it in others.
I have another yes or no question for you. A group of residents has tried to move to repeal the overnight parking ban. The city council has not been receptive to that. Do you favor a repeal of the overnight parking ban? David?
I do not support a blanket repeal of the overnight parking ban, in particular because the current village overlay district rezoning has no parking requirements. So my concern is that we're basically saving developer cost on parking and assuming that cost as a city, socializing that cost.
I think it was a yes or no answer I was looking for.
So the answer is no. I do not support a repeal, a broad repeal.
Dan, and you get to add 15 and a half words.
Yes, in certain places, we should keep the overnight parking ban. I am also supportive I'm sorry if I'm hitting my word count, of
No, no,
certain
no.
places with experimentation. As an example, there's a long open road somewhere where community residents, as part of the process, agree to do a pilot where they waive the overnight parking ban. I certainly would be happy to work with them. That said, there's a lot of residents who are my voters in precinct 1 who are concerned about Watertown cars being parked in our streets. We've got to make sure we balance this on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis.
Okay, and finally, in a short period of time, let's start with Dan first, then David. Why do you think that you are the best person to represent your ward on the city council?
Me first?
Yes.
Newton's done so much for my family. You know, my grandfather emigrated to Newton in the 1930s, fleeing anti-Semitism. Nearly a century later, I'm raising the 4th generation of my family on Cabot Street. So I'm a hometown kid running for one reason and one reason only, which is to help, to contribute to the community that shaped me into who I am today. And on the city council, I'll be able to apply my experiences as a presidential appointee in the Obama administration, as a policy wonk who worked for governors and senators, who is a father of a future Cabot School student, into a powerful lever of progress for our neighborhoods. I'm focused on making sure we embed those values I talked about earlier: walkability, affordability, and sustainability into the core of everything we're doing. And most of all, I'm proud to not only run a positive campaign, but one that's built bridges across Newton's very different factions, from all the different organizations backing me to half of the city council.
And David, the same to you.
Yeah, I want to put campaign jargon aside and give voters a chance to make an informed decision based on real differences. When it comes to zoning, I fully support adhering to the state mandate and zoning for 8,300 additional units in Newton. My opponent wants to zone for thousands more on top of that, including, as of this debate, 5-story buildings by right in Newtonville. I think that gives up too much power to developers. On education, I'm a former teacher, so I understand to a deeper degree what our teachers and schools need to succeed, and that's why the majority of Ward 2 Newton Public School educators are endorsing me and partnering on this campaign. And finally, I earned an MBA from MIT and advised some of the world's largest pension and sovereign wealth funds at Bridgewater, skills I will utilize when examining our budget to ensure Newton is spending your tax dollars responsibly. My name is David Micley, and I hope to earn your vote on or before November 7th. Thank you so much for having us.
I'm sorry, but yet again, you continue to throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. David, there is no evidence that I have at any time supported the 6 stories that you've put on your attack ad. I would very much appreciate if you stuck to the policy and the facts and not go out with fiction and fear mongering. It would be important that you demonstrate positive politics for both of our kids to grow up in a more collaborative ecosystem.
We cannot continue this any further.
Yeah.
Thank you both, gentlemen. A quick but important note: the printing of the ballot for November 7th is somewhat confusing. The ward councilor race for each of our wards is at the end of the school committee races on the back side of the ballot. It's not separated from the school committee races. So, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, vote for your ward councilor, but you'll have to go over to the back of the ballot and find whether you're going to vote for David Micley or Dan Gaynor if you live in Ward 6. We're going to be back in about 8 minutes for the next race, which is Martha Bixby and Lisa Gordon. So stick around. Thanks, Dan.
So much for fostering a good debate.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Good to see you, Dan. Take care.